Okay, we're going to start working on Chapter 6 tonight. And Chapter 6 really extends some of the concepts that we've been learning in Chapter 5, that is working with ActiveRecord and the database components. But it starts to reintegrate it back into our application in a more practical way. So we're going to be generating additional models, working with additional database components, and kind of enhancing what we already have to kind of enhance the application. And of course, it ties in well with the title there. One thing that we do want to do before we begin our work is jump into our folder structure and make a version of our work. So I'm going to go ahead and take my main blog folder, which is in my projects folder, and I'm going to make a copy of that and paste it right back in. And I'm going to call this one, I'm going to rename it and call it Chapter 5 Complete. Or, I mean, another title could be Start Chapter 6 Fresh, or, Chapter 6 Start, whatever works for you. But that way I always know I can go back to this point. Always remember that the book also has all of these exercises completed, and the source code is available from the publisher's website and through our Blackboard shell. And you can always pull those in if you're like something's like completely messed up or broken or not right. You can pull those in, and there's a command that you can run called bundle install that will update all the components in the project, and then you can work with your current version of Rails and Ruby. Right, so now that we've done our versioning, let's go into the book and start looking at the topics. All right, so we are going to be working basically with enhanced data models here. So we're really kind of ramping up the M part of the MVC. And notice that they do actually have a term called model enhancement. And that's just basically refers to the fact that the data models that we're building, we can add things to them to make them do more and basically add attributes and different types of validation. We can put logic structures into those models as well as just interfacing directly with the database. So they can get a little bit more sophisticated. And we can also, through the models, enforce other things that we've learned about databases, such as relationships and various associations between database tables and content. So that's kind of what we're doing here. So one thing that you're going to see is when we are working with ActiveRecord, and remember, whenever you see this syntax, when a class is declared in this language, this is actually the class name we're working with. The little pointer or bracket, however you want to think of it, that's the equivalent of like when we're working in a Java language and we say extends, right? So we're pulling in a superclass or a parent class and its capabilities, and we are pulling in ActiveRecord. So that's one of the reasons that the class user will have the capability to become a data model, is because it's pulling in the database superclass. But notice that it has also the base of ActiveRecord. So it also gives you the implication that there's higher levels of ActiveRecord that we're not necessarily utilizing at this point, but could. All right. We are going to be looking at a bunch of different files. So in combination with like working at the command prompt, which we're going to continue to do, but as we press forward, more of our work now is going to start shifting over to our text editor, where we're going to start manipulating the files that are either pre-created or created from the result of like generating a scaffolding, and then tweaking those files so that they perform certain tasks. So one of the things that we're going to do first is we're going to go to this folder, App Models Article RB. So I'm going to find that in my project folder. So I'm going to go into Blog and just pull that off to the side. App Models Article RB, and then I'm going to open that up in my text editor. Doesn't matter which text editor you use, just find one that you like. Preferably something that's got line numbers and something that color codes for the language you're working with. I just pretty much always use Notepad++ for utility tasks like this, because I just think it works well. All right, so now you see that we do have some slight differences here right away. And I think the first one I already mentioned to you. Notice how they are doing the validation here, and they have title as one separate statement and body as one separate statement. And what we did earlier in the book is we put them both on one line. They're functionally equivalent. If you want to separate it out, that's fine. In fact, you could argue pretty concretely that it's easier to read if I put in the whole darn line. I will want to get rid of that comma. Spacing, it doesn't matter too much, but let's keep that two-space indent rule going. And yes, they do want us to add this snippet as well. So if you want to type that in manually, that's fine. I'm going to attempt to copy-paste here from the PDF. When you do a copy-paste, anticipate cleanup work. So it comes with a little bit of a price. Now, I think we kind of get what the end statement does, but what is a def? D-E-F? What sounds like a definition, right? What do you think we're defining? A method, a function, or a procedure, depending on what you want to call them. In this language, you do call them methods. And so we're creating one called long title. And then if you notice what it's doing, it's just creating a string, really, right? It's taking a string, and it's taking a hash of the title. And the hash is going to function dynamically. It's basically going to pull in the information dynamically with whatever particular one we're working with at the time. I want you also to notice, and maybe you guys, some of you conceptualize this already, that when we were talking about ActiveRecord above, you guys noticing here we're using application record. Now, is this a difference between the versions?
Mine says ActiveRecord.
All right. Yours says ActiveRecord, but you're using an older version, right? We're all using, most of us here are using a more modern version. Does everybody say application record? Aaron, Christian? Does yours say application record or active record?
Application record.
Okay. So I know this for a fact. There's no problem here. You guys are all just fine. We're looking at platform differences and version differences. Things will still work. They've just renamed some of the libraries. Now I get people that freak out when they see this stuff and they start changing the code. We are working with a file that's already been generated. The file was generated automatically. I am not going to be brave and change what it's extending, because guess what I think is going to happen? I think it's just going to break, right? So you have to be kind of on your feet with this stuff and understand that stuff that's pre-generated automatically, you really typically don't want to mess with. Yes, it's different than what's in the book, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. All right. Really what we're doing here is we're just compiling a longer title very quickly. All right. They do want us to jump to the Rails console, so if you have a prompt open, and that's not the right one, navigate into your project folder, and then type the command Rails console, which launches the console application relative to that project. I'm going to take a moment for the prompt to come up, and there it is. So we do have the interactive Ruby prompt all set to go. And let's split screen here a little bit. Trying to figure out where my content is. There we go. Way up at the top. All right. Next thing we're going to do is we are actually going to create a new article. So we're going to type in this whole command. And because it's split over 2 lines, and this is the pattern here, you guys should be used to this. I'm jumping over to my text editor, creating a new tab, pasting in that command. I notice that it is on two distinct lines. That's not going to work for us. So I'm going to come up here to the end of the first line, add a space, press delete to combine those into one. And now I'm going to Control A to select all, Control C to copy, and then I'm going to take that to my prompt and drop it in. Windows 10, which is what I'm running here, does allow me to do a Control V. Seems to kind of be obscured from view a little bit, but it should work just fine, so I'm going to go ahead and press enter, and you can see that indeed it did work just fine. So it went ahead, began the transaction, and did a commit. If you want to bring up your SQLite browser, you guys can see for me it's a habit to do this and just do a refresh and just see that indeed you did add a new entry. Notice that the ID that it created for it though is ID number 9. Right? So somewhere in its infrastructure for the database it keeps track. Even if you deleted the IDs, it keeps track of them. Back to the prompt, back to the book. Now since we added that code to the article RB file, it's freaking out there a little bit because it wasn't the right version. You guys notice that my icon here is still red. I'm not saved yet. Alright, so before you run this next command, make sure you hit save. Because now what we're going to have the capability to do is we added to the article model, we're going to type article.last.long title. So this isn't a pre-existing method, this is one that we just created, and all it does is it takes the title and the publish that date, and then it repeats them to us, and it says unknown method long title. Great. So we got a problem here already, don't we? Yeah, you guys didn't get that error, but I sure did. So I got to go looking now as to what is wrong. Does anybody see any problems with any of my code? It's possible, because I did do a create, but it did save to the database. Did I spell article correctly? I did. Article.create title, did all that stuff. Did I spell it correctly here at the prompt? What's happening is it's not recognizing the method. I'm actually going to retype the command. Still. Well, maybe I should try something different. So what I'm trying to show you guys is some of my troubleshooting skills now. Well, article last didn't work. What if I try article first long title? It's still saying that the method is undefined. So now I have this concern. Am I looking at the right file? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually close all these files that I have sitting open here. No, no, no. How many are there? We want to know. Apparently more than a few. You see all those that I had open? So how did I know that I really actually was working on the right file? You see the issue there. So really what I'm going to do is I'm going to close many of these. I just want to get all this junk out of the way. Alright. And that's probably fine. I can leave that one open. Alright. So let's go ahead and try to open up that file again. I want to make sure I'm in the right folder. Blog. So really what I'm doing, folks, is I'm going back to this point and redoing this step. Because I have a suspicion that maybe it didn't work correctly. So app, models, article, RB, edit with Notepad++. Well, it looked like it's saved. Now I did copy paste this stuff in, right? So I always have this concern when I do copy pastes. Did I bring along little artifacts that I can't even see? That's a possibility. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually kind of arrowing through and backspace and deleting and just kind of making sure that there's no extraneous junk here. And I don't see any problem. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. Does anybody think that there should be anything else I should do before I run this step? Did the book tell us to do anything else? It doesn't. So what I have to do now is I'm going to go back and I'm going to retype that command, and let's see what happens. And you see how I'm like being manual about it this time. No copy pasting going on. I want to make sure it's typed exactly right. I'm still getting the error. Any suggestions?
I'm not getting an error on this screen.
Who did anybody in the classroom get an error? Okay, did you get the same error as me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going back and looking at the database right now, and I think that what I need to do is I might need to just test a couple of things. So here's my thought pattern. If I type article.last, is it pulling up that last article? Yes, it is. It absolutely is. Now, had I saved the changes before I ran the Rails console? You guys catching that? All right, so what am I going to do? I'm going to actually exit. And then I'm going to run the Rails console again. So I'm just showing you troubleshooting techniques here. These are little things, that pitfalls you guys might fall into. So I'm just going to do article.last. Should pull back the last article. It did. So now I'm going to try article.last.long title, and guess what? It worked. So what was the problem?
The console didn't know it.
The console didn't know it because I hadn't saved the file before the console was launched. Isn't that interesting? So I wouldn't necessarily think of that as being a problem. But, you know, this is the kind of troubleshooting you guys have to do, and the kind of thing, you know, where I do get students that are like, oh, I tried this, you know, I did everything you did, but if you did everything I did, you screwed up just like I did. Especially if you went step by step. So. Okay, let's move on to the next bit. All right. Now, some of the things that there's always terminology that they're always pointing out. You guys remember what DRY stands for? Yes, don't repeat yourself. And there's also a different type of thing where we call fat models. And what we are kind of doing is we're building a data model that has functionality within it. And basically, whenever you're adding functionality, logical programming functionality to a data model, they call that a fat model. Because really, one of the principles of DRY is to usually try to avoid putting too much logic into a model. This is pretty simplistic logic. But I wouldn't like put like a sort algorithm in the model definition. You could, but it's not really an appropriate place for it. It's really more about the separation of concerns. That's part of the MVC approach. All right. Next thing that we need to kind of refresh our brains on is some database stuff that you guys probably learned early on. When you are working with databases, often you're working with databases that do contain more than one table, right? And then you hear the term relational database, which basically refers to how data in the various tables in the database are related to each other. And the concept of proper database design is that, for example, if we were all students in the student database, it wouldn't make sense that every time a grade was posted in the database that it also included all of your demographic information with it, right? Like your address, phone number, and email address. That makes no sense. Really all they need to do is take your student ID number, maybe the course ID number, and the grade. And that would be the whole table, right? But somewhere else that ID number is connected to your demographic information, and there's no reason to be repeating that. So proper relational database design is kind of a pretty sophisticated little thing for organizing data in a logical way. And one of the things that they're pointing out here is that in this set of tools, yes, it is a database relationship that we're talking about, but they're also referring to it as an association. Now, the reason that they call it an association is because there is a very slightly different association to that term, where relationship that we work with in a typical database you define usually as one-to-one or one-to-many or many-to-many. That stuff should sound familiar to you guys. But an association here basically allows us to form a link between tables and pieces of information. So saying that a piece of information in this table that we call ID, and here's an example right here, is the ID, because see this comes from the articles table, it's the ID for an article. So in this other table, which has its own ID field, we can't call it the same thing, but we're going to call it article ID. Now, what's fascinating about this stuff is how we do these connections. So remember that when we're naming things in these languages, they have certain conventions they want us to follow. And one of those conventions is when we are building a data model for a table, that we use the singular capitalized name and then the plural lowercase name for the table. Then notice that if you are connecting to any other table, that they want you to stick with a convention that if you're going to use that article ID in a different table, that you call it article ID, so it matches up to the table and it's pretty clear what it is. That's kind of the point of this little bit. Now the fun thing about this language, and one of the things that makes it both powerful and kind of like scaringly flexible, is the fact that you can take those associations once they're formed and use really simplistic syntax, sometimes interchangeably. And this is the thing that sometimes blows people's minds, because you would think that, for example, you see these examples. So article.comments. Well, the article is stored in one table. We've already seen that, right? And apparently later on we're going to put comments in for those articles. Well, those comments are stored somewhere else. And somewhere in the background there's a link between article and comments by virtue of that ID that ties them together. So every time a comment goes in, it gets its own ID, but it also is associated to a particular article, so it will have an article ID attached to it. Once that association is created, we can then say article.comments, and very often we can also flip it and say comments.article, and it works the same, which is kind of bizarre. All right. So, but it does make for a really nice syntax when we're writing code, both at a prompt and within the application. Now, the types of associations that we create will vary, but you can see that the types of relationships that you learned about in the past, so one to many, or one to one, right? So has one would imply what? One to one. Has many, is that many to many? I'm not really sure. Is there one to many? And then there's this other one, belongs to. Well, that doesn't even sound like a relationship. It sounds like being possessive. Belongs to, doesn't that kind of imply the fact that it has to connect? Can you think of any relationships that you learned about in database class where you had to have a connection? So for example, if you have like a foreign key and a primary key, right? And you can't really have an entry in a secondary table if there is no foreign key relationship to the, so if you remember all that kind of stuff. They just use a different syntax here. Now their attempt in doing it is that you have both a definition and an understanding by virtue of how verbose they're trying to make it. For me, frankly, it doesn't always work, but has and belongs to many sounds like a many to many with an enforced foreign key, right? Okay, maybe it sounds like that to you. All right, so here they have a quick little example. It says, the message model declares as a has many relationship with attachment. Okay, so the message model has many attachments. All right, so a particular message could have many attachments. Okay, so you think of like an email message. Is that true? Sure it is, right? I can have a message and I can have more than one attachment. That makes sense. Now, from the attachments standpoint, so you flip your position, the attachment belongs to message. Isn't that interesting? So I can have many attachments, but once I've attached something, it belongs to a particular message. It's not attached to something else. So that's why we use the term belongs to. So it's kind of enforcing that connection back. All right, so that's a little weird. All right, so now they're starting to jump into like a little bit more standard database terminology. And in this first example, we're looking at one-to-one associations. All right. Now, before we can start to demonstrate some of these things, right now we're only working with one data model, and that's for the articles, because we only have one table. But if we're going to be building an application that's a blog, think of all the things that a blog does, right? With a blog, if you guys have ever blogged or been party to one thing that you do is you create user accounts, usually to have the capability to either create content or comment on things. So one thing that we have to do is we are going to generate a table for users, and we're going to generate a model for users. And notice we have this beautiful command here that's going to do all the work in one fell swoop. And we are going to bring up the prompt here. So this command, this one should paste cleanly. So I'm here at the prompt, and I'm going to paste in. It looks like it's not wide enough.
You don't want to put that in the IRB, do you?
Do I?
No.
Oh, you spoiled my fun. See, usually I do this stuff and people catch me or don't catch me. And Brian, you know what? Kudos for catching it right off the bat. Because right now I'm at a Ruby prompt. And in the book, when we're working at a Ruby prompt, you're going to see a prompt that looks like this. When you see a $sign prompt on a Mac or Linux system, that is what your regular prompt looks like. On a PC, we would see the C prompt, right? So I actually don't want to put this command here at all. Brian is absolutely correct. Excuse me. But I was just kind of working to see like I could generate the error message and get you guys, why didn't it work? All right, so I'll type exit at the Ruby prompt.
Spoiling your fun.
Yes, you are spoiling my fun, but actually it shows me that you're either working ahead or reading, actually, which is a good thing too. All right, so here we are at the regular C prompt now, and now I'm going to paste in that regular command. Remember, the regular command is indicated by the fact that when you see a $sign prompt in here, that indicates that we're working at a C prompt in Windows or a regular bash prompt in Linux or the Mac OS. All right, so here I am at the prompt. I got the command typed in, and what are we going to do? We're going to generate a model user, and apparently we're going to have a couple of fields that we're adding to a table. So you got to remember what generate model does is it generates a database table, and it generates a Ruby file in the models app models folder that associates to that, so that we have a programmatic connection from our application to the database. Creating two columns in that table. One is going to be a string column that contains email address, and one's another one that's a string that's a password. I'm pressing enter. And here we go. Shows you the stuff it created. Didn't really create a lot, but it did it. All right, so it shows you the things it created. All right, and one of the things that it does here, notice that when it does the creation in the app models folder, it did create a file called user. It also placed in the database migration folder a time-stamped create users Ruby file. Now, the interesting thing about that is if I go to the SQLite browser now and I take a look, do I have, I'm going to hit that refresh button a couple times, do I have that table's not here. Why? Because I have not migrated the database, folks. Now, they are having us go into the folder, and interestingly enough, we're going to, I happen to already be in that folder, so I'm in Projects, Blog, App, Models folder, right? So right inside, oh no, that's not where I want to be, right? I want to go back to the root of the blog, find my database, my migration folder. Notice that in this newer version you just call it migrate. Same difference. There's the create user file we just created today at this time. I'm going to give it a right click and open it up in Notepad++, and I'm going to compare it here and go, yep, looks pretty much the same. Notice that the migration, we told it to add a string, 2 string columns, right, email and password. We didn't tell it to put timestamps in there. It does that automatically. So could I delete that? Sure, I totally could. Should I? Oh, why bother? Frankly. But it also shows you that even though we generated something from the command line, I can come in here and manually add some more. Now, the migration, this is basically a snippet of code that is going to tell our application what to generate within the database when I run the database migration. I am anticipating that that's our next command, right? Not quite. You know why? Take a look at what the next command is. They want us to generate something more. They want us to generate another model right off the bat. This is a multi-line one. So I'm going to grab it and we are going to buffer that into a text editor. So creating a new document, paste it in, get my cursor in here, add a space, press delete, get it all in one line, highlight it all, copy, and then off to the prompt we go. And in this case, before I hit enter, I want to read through this code a little bit, or this command a little bit. And it does say Rails generate model, so that creates a database table and the Ruby file in the models folder, and a file in the migration folder. And we are going to have a column for user ID, which is an integer, a name, string, birth date, which is a date, a bio, color, Twitter. Apparently Twitter is the thing. So now we will press enter and allow it to do its work. It did something very similar to what happened before. So we generated 2 new models, created 2 new database migrations, 2 new Ruby files, and now we are ready to run the database migration. So we are going to type rake db:/migrate, and then we're going to press enter. So what this command does is it goes to that migration folder, looks at the commands that are present, runs them, and then creates the stuff for the database. And as you can see, it says create table users, create table profiles. So guess what? If I go back to my SQLite browser now and do a refresh and hit the drop down, hello, they're not there. Why? Well, you know what? I'm going to reopen it. And then I'm going to browse the data again, and now I can see the new tables. And if I go to profiles, you see all the stuff I added? If I go to users, you can see email and password. And of course, now that we've created additional tables, now we have the challenge. We've got to start telling the tables how the information in these tables relate to each other, if indeed they even do. All right, so we're at the bottom of page 86. All right, so one of the first tasks, and I know we are basically out of time here, so we're probably just going to make these couple of changes, and we're going to call it a class and have to pick up next time, past the date for our next class. So I know right now I have it set for October 31st, and that's going to move back to past the next day of class, which is November 1st, is that right? So I'll probably set it for the 2nd or the 3rd. That way we should be able to finish it in class, but just in case you can't, you'll still have a couple extra days. You are welcome to work ahead, though. All right, we took a little pause here to talk about a couple of issues. We had one person that didn't wisely follow my put all your commands on one line, so he basically left it like this. And what happened is that these 3 columns weren't created in the database as a result. So what you can do is you can actually go manually to that file and add these in the fashion that the others are placed in. So for example, if we were looking at this file, we would just take those additional things and add them in here. We'd go back to our console, run rake db migrate, and it would build it right into the database for us. Now, because the subsequent examples kind of build off of each other, I am actually going to stop us right here. So I'm going to call this complete up through page 86. When we come back next time, we'll tweak the files and continue on. And we should be able to plow through the whole chapter next time, especially if we're all here on time and ready to code right when the bell strikes 5:30. All right? And thank you guys for being all very helpful and compliant and all that. And we'll call it a night. So this is chapter 6 up through page 86, and we'll continue it next week. And have a good week.